So, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, thank you very much also to the previous speakers for their excellent introductions. I know I'm here at a forum which is mostly focused on economics and business, but I would nevertheless like to devote my 10-15 minutes to politics, and the politics of EU enlargement to be precise. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate Ms. President with the fact that today the General Affairs Council of the European Union approved candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is good news, and I think we need some good news in EU enlargement. Yeah, let's see. The reason that I want to talk about EU enlargement and this politics for EU enlargement is, I think, the political future of the European continent. The level of political integration on our continent, of course, has a huge impact also on business and economic cooperation. I mean, the fact, for example, that Romania and Bulgaria have not yet gotten the approval to become a part of the Schengen area, of course, it impacts the trade between those countries and the rest of the European Union. Now, the history of EU enlargement, as we sometimes tend to forget, has been a very successful one. From an economic community of 6 countries focused on coal and steel cooperation, this developed into the European communities, and that grew in the early 2000s to eventually a European Union of 28 and now 27 member states. And I think this widening and this deepening of the European Union, it really has led to a stable, secure, and economically prosperous continent. The latest Big Bang enlargement round of the EU in 2004 and 2007, and of course afterwards also the joining of Croatia, it has not been without its problems. I mean, with currently 27 member states, the EU's decision-making capabilities, as well as its ability to live up to its own democratic standards, have been increasingly under pressure. And we also see that the current EU enlargement round, that is the one, well, with the Western Balkans and nowadays also Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia has a perspective. But this current round with the Balkans started in 2003, and as such, it's taking a very long time. I think what we see is that the reforms that the EU would like to see happening in terms of democracy, in terms of good governance, those are coming about only slowly, and we've also seen on the part of the EU, on the side of the EU, sometimes delays over issues that have had nothing much to do with the actual accession process. And then, of course, this year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fully and severely undermined the geopolitical stability and security of our European continent. Now, all of this poses questions for EU enlargement and the future of European integration. Should the EU further enlarge quickly with the countries of the Western Balkans, with Moldova, Ukraine, or Georgia, or potentially even others? Because of these geopolitical issues? And if geopolitics plays a role in the decision-making, how to go about the requirements of good governance and democracy? And lastly, functioning of the EU with 27 member states is already under pressure. Shouldn't there be internal reforms first before we continue with enlargement? Well, these are some of the questions that I would like to discuss in my presentation. But before coming to those, let's zoom in a little bit on the current EU enlargement process, and especially with the Western Balkans, and why things are going so slow. Because in practice, EU enlargement is, of course, a very straightforward, or in theory, I must say, EU enlargement is, of course, a very straightforward process. I mean, any country in Europe can apply to become a member of the European Union. EU decides whether a country meets basic democratic and economic criteria to start the process. And in theory, after a country gains candidate status, the negotiations start, legislative alignment takes place, and when that process is finished, and of course, legislative alignment is a very immense process. It entails everything from EU fisheries policies to justice and home affairs matters, from public procurement law to the common foreign and security policy. But after that alignment, a candidate can become a member of the EU. That's the theory, at least. And this process is based on a principle that we call the conditionality principle, right? The idea that candidates advance on their EU path only after making adequate reforms. And then there's the central incentive, which is, of course, the EU membership and all the benefits that come with that, amongst which a seat at the political seat at the table, right, of the EU, but also access to EU structural funds, etc. Now, in practice, I'm afraid that the process is not as straightforward as it is in theory. There are countries in the process that are formally frontrunners. Take Serbia or Montenegro, for example. They're frontrunners formally in EU accession, and their European integration path is progressing. But at the same time, there are independent reports, such as, for example, Freedom House, that show that in terms of democratic development, sometimes things are not going forward, standing still, or even backsliding. Now, I think that most analysts working on EU enlargement actually agree that these countries are nowhere near completion of the process, and that they're, it will take some more years before these countries can join, even if the process is already taking such a long time. I mean, Montenegro has been negotiating since 2012, Serbia since 2014, so it's already a very long process. So then the question is, why is this conditionality principle not working? Well, I think one of the problems is that this actual accession perspective, the main incentive for countries to reform, is weak. And that's, for example, because the EU has failed or delayed to reward countries that have taken the necessary steps. So we've seen, I know I'm in Greece here, but I must say I'm Dutch, so I can be frank, right? We've seen that, for example, North Macedonia, it has been blocked for a long time in its European integration path on issues that have not much to do with the actual accession criteria. And even after signing the Prespa agreement with Greece, there were still more delays, and only this summer the country was able to actually start its negotiations. And in this whole accession process, of course, EU member states have a veto, so they can basically block every step of the way. And this constitutes a problem. And I think what we also see is that this credibility of the European Union to sort of set demands has also gone down in the past years because of the rule of law issues that we see within the European Union. So in short, one of the problems is that the EU is not fully living up to its own side of the deal and its own standards. Well, second, then on the side of the candidates, reforms on especially core issues like democracy, independence of the judiciary, banning high-level corruption, etc., these things are taking longer than expected. And I don't think we should question whether these countries at large want to join the European Union, but sometimes steps that governments take are not always in that interest. And you see that sometimes laws on paper are aligned with the European Union, but the actual societal and political transformation does not take place, or only very slowly. And the problem with the EU has been that it has sometimes also been a bit, scared maybe, or hesitant, let's put it that way, to call out on a lack of reforms or on undemocratic behavior. In the Netherlands, we say, there's a saying that you can play good weather. You can show things and put them in a very positive light, even if in practice things may not be as positive as that. So, I mean, for example, we saw that Commission President von der Leyen visited Serbia this, I think it was earlier this year, and she said Serbia is well advanced on its European integration path. Formally, maybe that's true, but as I also noted, there are still some problems that the country will need to overcome to join the EU. And I think also in the technical reports from the European Commission, we see that there's detailed monitoring on all requirements, but sometimes they fail to really call a spade on whether things are moving in the right direction for the accession process at large, right? So to come to an overall conclusion of whether things are heading in the right direction. Now, there are some other things. Of course, the bilateral issues and conflicts that we see in the Balkans region have not been fully resolved. We've seen in the past week how explosive relations between Serbia and Kosovo still are. As long as there's no final agreement, this risk of escalation remains, unfortunately. And of course, Russia is a country that's very keen to capitalize on such tensions and to try to actually spur them up to maintain some influence in the region and also to withhold the region from its EU integration path. Now, that leaves us with a lot of frustrations on both sides. There's this idea or the saying that the Balkan countries are in this ever-during waiting room. And then I haven't even talked about Turkey, which is a country where I think the accession process is, well, at this point, accession perspective is not very feasible at all. Maybe I should try to take a somewhat more optimistic view because there are many things happening and in a way, also with Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, the EU, of course, has a chance to do better. And the roadmap for that is already there because the EU itself also recognized in 2020 in its revised accession methodology that not everything is going well, and it recognized some of these problems that I just sketched. So the current EU strategy has this ambition for more practical engagement, for clearer political communication, for reversibility, and all these kind of things to ensure a merit-based and straightforward approach. Now, if the EU wants to capitalize on that and do these, take the right steps, I think it will need to make sure that this accession process is indeed straightforward again, and that it is able to decide on new steps in the process if countries have made the necessary reforms, that bilateral issues do not stand in the way. I think the geopolitical situation in Europe does call for speeding up the process, being serious about the consolidation of the European continent, and I think this is also something that the EU and the Western Balkans leaders last week in Tirana at their summit recognized. But to finish, I think that the current approach will not be enough. I mean, even during this accession process, we will need to make sure that cooperation and engagement between the candidate countries and those who are not yet a candidate on the one hand and the EU improves. And that, of course, Europe at large, it's facing many crises, right? It's on energy security, on migration management, on security, on climate, on housing and jobs. And these are common crises that require common solutions. So it means that the Balkans and the Eastern neighbors will need to be integrated in decision-making procedures before already becoming a formal member of the EU. And I think there are many promising ideas in the expert community on so-called phased integration that the EU can take further. And I'm also glad to see that in last week's Tirana summit, indeed, it recognized the need for engagement beyond the mere enlargement process. And I think, therefore, this forum is also so important where we are here today, Balkans and Black Sea Forum, because it really focuses on sectoral cooperation, right? It focuses on topics of climate change, on digital, on many topics that we've connectivity, and these are the things where we can move forward.
Well, your time.
I'm finishing.
Yes,
thank you. So just to conclude, the EU enlargement, I think the process is in somewhat rough waters to remain in the maritime spheres. Europe at large faces many crises. The only answer will be to enhance cooperation and to be open and honest towards each other. And I think we need to creatively think about new models for the widening and deepening of the European Union and take those further. Thank you.